Hello and welcome to this week's bonus episode of Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. This week I spoke with Rupert Russell, who's a former academic who then went on to become a filmmaker, documentary maker, and an author. He recently released the film Price Wars in German for the channel Arte, and the book Price Wars, which is all about how prices have caused the meta crisis that we see today. Essentially, how the deregulation of the commodities market in the early 2000s spurred a huge profiteering drive of speculation, which has caused food prices to go up and therefore caused revolutions, which has caused bits to do with climate change, the Arab Springs, unrest over Africa, the housing market bubble, and the global financial crash in 2008. Rupert's book is fantastic. I highly suggest you get a copy of it. I so enjoyed reading it. It not only paints a fantastic interconnected picture of how the global financial system, which is what he calls, magic, and magical and fantastical, and how that affects the physical world and that feedback loop. But he also really manages to clearly explain a lot of the financial jargon that I certainly have found really difficult to understand over the past few years, like what is a derivative and what is a future contract, and the difference between quantification and financialization and all this. So treat yourself and go and get a copy of his book. We touched upon a lot of different things during the interview. We tried to kind of narrow in on that feedback loop between the physical world and the fantastical, speculative financial world. Because Rupert's argument is that prices reflect and engender chaos because they price in potential instability, and how often that makes the inevitable instability actually worse because prices have already dictated how bad it could be, and therefore it is that bad. I'm paraphrasing there. And what I wanted to further get into with him was, well, do we not live in a very specific time of history where the physical implications of the climate crisis are not just going to be the result of that feedback loop, but are then going to start feeding back into that feedback loop? And then what impact will that have on the financial markets? This is a very chicken and the egg scenario, and we probably don't have the data yet to better understand how that equation will be formed, because certainly the front line of the climate crisis right now is vulnerable peoples and in nations that are on the edge of chaos, as Rupert puts it. And the global financial system doesn't really care about them as long as the resources and the commodities are still coming out of their nations. So we probably don't have anything on that yet to establish. And I should point out here, actually, Rupert has a solution to the problem that the market is causing, i.e. creating chaos, creating wars. And he says that's to regulate. We need to regulate commodities. We need to regulate the market. And we could do that overnight and have a hugely beneficial effect around the world and lift millions of people out of poverty. And I really, really like that, because whilst we kind of maybe get into a bit of a back and forth about how to do that towards the end of the episode, it is a pragmatic step that can be taken tomorrow that could have immediate results and is also technically the norm. It's only been 20 odd years that we've been living with a deregulated commodities market. For the 100 years before that, 150, it was regulated. So it's again a shift in like narrative and storytelling about what is normal, what is historical, what can be, and using that historicity to reveal and emphasize what is possible. The thing that I want to get into is what Rupert hits home again and again and again and again is it is the opacity of information that allows the markets to speculate, or allows people to use the markets to speculate and profiteer. So by their very nature, they demand an unequal, unequitable distribution of information, which is a resource. But curiously, he gave this fantastic example of this company that were using satellites to predict how much each harvest around the world would yield. And they went to these founders, they went to the hedge fund managers and they said, we have this information. So, you could use it when you're creating your future contracts and when you're, essentially betting on how much wheat there will be, for example. And the hedge fund manager said, we don't want this. We don't need this, because we're not actually betting on the reality. We're betting on what everybody else is betting on. So unless they have this same information, it's not actually going to be useful to us. can you skew the data for us? And then it will be useful. And so these people really understood that not only is data unhelpful, but incorrect data is more helpful to their goal of making a profit. Because it is essentially just one big form of gambling the market. I think that serves to highlight that the whole, Hayek's concept that markets make decisions and there's an invisible hand is complete nonsense. I think it also serves to highlight that when thinking about the climate crisis or the meta crisis, the poly crisis, the state of the world that we live in, again, education is key to finding solutions. If global wealth inequality has increased vociferously, terribly over the past few decades, and a very mechanism of that global wealth inequality is either the deliberate manipulation and skewing of or opacity of information, then surely the first thing to combat that would be providing information to people. Then the question becomes, where does that information come from? How do you democratize information? And what relationships information have to intention? And then that gets into citizenship and creating good citizens and restructuring value systems. Because obviously one person can have the data and reject the information, and doesn't need information if their intention is, in this example, to make money from a speculative market. So somebody can have information and the wrong intentions and reject it. Some people can have the right intentions and the wrong information and then end up either achieving nothing or doing the wrong thing. So what is the relationship between how we start making correct decisions to restructure the social fabric of our world using the information that we have, and how do we achieve that in a sort of informational void, which is hobbling those that have good intentions and being abused by those with bad intentions? Again, another chicken and the egg scenario, which is why every systems thinker on this podcast says that the solutions are complex and multifaceted, and essentially we need to hit multiple levers at the same time. Otherwise, everything will fail. It makes me think of what Dan Fiskus said about how science is failing the crisis, and how that paradigm of knowledge above else and trying to position that in a space that is void of values has been inherently unhelpful, if not dangerous. We are massively running out of time to achieve anything when it comes to the climate crisis. And yet, again and again and again, this theme comes up that the solution lies in that marriage of education and value system. So information and intention. If we had a couple of generations to achieve it, I'm sure we could do it. We don't. So how do you hack that? How do you update people's value systems whilst also giving them information that is perhaps currently oppositional to their current value system? I don't know. But then again, value systems change massively. The commodities market was regulated 20 years ago, and now it's not. So neoliberalism was they just opened the throttle on neoliberalism, but it wasn't the norm. So it must be possible. It cannot just be a generational thing. Maybe this is the message that we need to start saying as well. The hope of a new world does not lie in the myth of having generations in order to change things. We can change things very quickly and very effectively with the right messaging, with the right communication, with the right intention, and with the right information. I don't know. I'm starting to think more and more that this is a problem of narrative and storytelling, but then that is my field. So of course, that's what I would think. I would love to know what you think, so please leave a comment and let me know. Also, if there's somebody that you want me to interview on the podcast, leave a comment below and I will see it. I will contact them and hopefully get them on. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you're a long time or even medium time listener and you're really enjoying it, consider supporting Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. It is the support of my patrons that allows me to continue doing this work and investing so much time in this work. So if you have the means, I would greatly appreciate you joining the community. To everyone who's tuned in, I hope this was enjoyable. I hope this was valuable. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next week.